Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the next in our lecture series. Before we should begin, I should like to tell you about the exhibition, which is the St. Orchid Artists. That is going to be extended until February 15th. We are currently halfway through our Winter 1 session. Winter 2 will start on February the 1st. So if anyone is interested in signing up, we should have that semester up by the end of next week. Please visit our website, atelier@flowerfield.org, for information, or you can always call us at 631-250-9009. So tonight we have our instructor, Christian White, giving a talk on Manet and modernism about the use of color in modern times. Christian White is a well-known artist who's exhibited extensively in the New York area. So we should like to welcome him right now. So Christian, I'm going to turn this over to you, and I hope you all enjoy it.
So tonight I'm going to try, as I have before, but try a little harder, to explain my fascination with modernism and especially with color and how modernism sort of changed our concept of color. There were many factors involved, but I'm going to start with Manet. Actually, there were sort of two beginnings to modernism. I always used to cite the opening of trade with Japan by Commodore Perry in the middle of the 19th century as the beginning of modernism. But the truth is, modernism had already started with the realist movement in sort of the first half of the 19th century. So we're talking about people like Millet and Courbet and Turner even, and especially Corot. Realism was not considered the same thing as academic painting, because academic painting was trying to present a glorified and idealized world, which was reminiscent of sort of classical times. This is probably because of the First Empire and Napoleon's fascination with empirical Rome. But the art world was kind of ruled by the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris, and artists were sort of limited to subjects and styles which they thought were worthwhile. And a group of artists pretty much ignored that. And they called their movement realism because they wanted their paintings to depict real life, but also to resemble real life. In other words, to look like reality. That wasn't the intention of like academic painting at the time. So I'm going to share my screen now. David, who epitomized academic painting. David was he was a pretty good portraitist. He did some pretty bad paintings about the Oath of the Horatia, in my opinion. But this is probably his best painting. This is called The Death of Marat. He was a friend of Marat's. Marat was an ally of Robespierre, who was pretty much responsible for the Reign of Terror in France, the senseless guillotining of anybody whose ideas were a little bit different about the Republic than his. As it happens, Marat was murdered by a cousin of one of my ancestors, Charlotte Corday, who was a cousin of Esther Cortez, one of my ancestors, who was the mother of famous American revolutionary Sir Francis Marion, General Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. one of Washington's greatest weapons in the Revolutionary War. So depending on what your ideas were, whether you were a Jacobin or not, either Charlotte Corday is a great hero or she's a great villain. History hasn't really picked a side on that. She was guillotined. Anyway, this is a painting that was created as a political tool, as propaganda, and was used directly, this painting, in inciting sort of anger and rioting and an enormous amount of bloodshed. But you'll notice that it's not about color at all. It's depends on chiaroscuro modeling. It would be just as effective as a piece of sculpture. And I'll show you another academic figure from the Paris in the 19th century. This is Ernest Mason. There's a great book called The Judgment of Paris about the tension between Manet and Meissonier. They were sort of the opposite kinds of painters. And Meissonier, another huge admirer of Napoleon. This painting is called Friedland. It was the most expensive painting in the 19th century. It was bought sight unseen by A.T. Stewart, whose wife happened to be another one of my ancestors. But you can see the problem with academic painting here, with the academic use of color, for instance. Extremely chaotic here. Meissonier was thought he was trying to do the same thing realists were doing. In other words, he wanted things to be accurate as possible. He actually built a railroad on his estate so he could ride along next to galloping horses and draw them while they were galloping. And the result is these two extremely awkward horses in identical positions in the foreground. And this other group of three horses at the trot on the left. And this confusing, incomprehensible and excess of detail that doesn't look anything like an army. He painted all these blades of grass, really has nothing to do with the story or the picture. It's just distracting. The truth is, the ancient Greeks, 300 BC, were better at painting an army with horses than this. And I would recommend you take a look at the Battle of Issus. It's in Naples, in the National Museum in Naples, but you can certainly find pictures of it. And if you ever get a chance to go to that museum, one of the great museums of the world, I highly recommend it. Because the scale of that piece, the one in Naples is actually a mosaic copy of the original painting, which no longer exists. So this was kind of not what modernism was trying to do, because you don't believe it. This painting is not a very large painting. You can go and see it. It's in the hallway of the European painting section on the second floor of the Metropolitan Museum. It does not give you a sense of being at a scene like this at all. It just looks like someone who worked a long hard, and Masonry spent years on this painting. Someone who's just trying too hard. It's confusing. There's way too much information in it. It's incoherent. My opinion. This is all my opinion. Everything, by the way, I can tell you tonight is my opinion, unless it's history, which I do research. But here's Manet doing a similar thing, horses galloping, but he has them galloping right at you to make sure you know that it's not something he's witnessing, but something he's imagined. He also did not understand what horses' legs look like galloping, but here he has our willing suspension of disbelief, um, because he's made it much simpler and there's much less information. He has two crowds here without describing a single one of them, a single person. The perspective on the fence on the left is not right. Manet struggled terribly with perspective because he never finished his art schooling and he was not a good student anyway. So why does this work? It works because it's a simpler idea. There's less information. It's much more unified than the Masonry. And I can tell you, I've stood in front of both of these paintings, and this one is the one that's exciting because it's a very original idea to paint horses galloping at you at, as fast as they can and make you feel you're about to be trampled by a bunch of horses. So Manet had several studios, and for almost a decade, he had a studio on the Rue de St. Petersburg. And I haven't seen that studio, but I've heard it described as having one whole side of the studio be glass and even part of the roof. So enormous light source, very much like the photographer Nader's studio. Nader was a good friend of Manet's. Anyway, it produces very flat lighting, very little chiaroscuro, much more like the ukiyo-e prints that everybody was so fascinated by, which have no modeling in them ever. This is also telescopic perspective, which is quite odd. The fact that the feet are the same size in relation to the head that they would be if he was standing up is peculiar. I mean, it is what someone would look like from a great distance. You can see his legs are floating in the air, though. They don't cast a shadow or anything. This was part of a much bigger painting, which received such ridicule when Manet showed it that he cut it in half. But the top was a bull ring with toreador and a bull and a crowd and everything. Here's some cartoons of it in the paper making fun of it. Because of the awkwardness of the perspective, again, this top drawing is probably a little bit closer to what it felt like. Again, Manet's lack of knowledge of Albertian geometry made it very hard for him to paint anything that he was imagining. So there's, in many of these paintings, there's this wonderful painting because his observational perspective was flawless. But then part of the picture may be a little incoherent because of what he didn't know. Here you can see the problem. So this is a woman dressed in a matador's costume, painted in his studio. Obviously, you can see the flat lighting, the same as in Le Déjeuner sur l'Herbe and Olympia. Those were all painted in the same studio. But by the laws of perspective, obviously a bull ring is a flat surface. The toreador and the horse and the bull would have to be sort of 1.5 feet tall if this picture made any sense. So the perspective is nonsensical, and yet it's still a great painting. It's still a great design. But I'm going to trace this through several paintings. This is the Battle of the Alabama and the Kearsarge, two American ships during Civil War. The Alabama was in a French port for repair, and the Kearsarge came, which was a Union ship, and sank it. And Manet did not witness this event, as some people have said, but he still tried to paint it, despite the fact that he hated the ocean. His parents had enlisted him in the French Navy. He'd spent a couple of years at sea, hated every minute of it. Did not like being on a boat, didn't like being on the water. But still, he was interested in painting this painting. This is kind of bird's eye view. So this is not as it might be seen from another boat or from the shore or anything like that. It's purely imagined point of view, like all of the ukiyo-e woodblock prints were. And the composition was heavily criticized, but this is really quite a modern painting, quite a modern composition. And later on, he did get to board the Kearsarge, and he said, you know what, it's pretty much like I imagined it. Now, this is another painting of incident about the same time in Mexico, the execution of the Emperor Maximilian. The French and the British and the Spanish had all invaded Mexico and installed this Austrian Emperor Maximilian, or rather the French installed the Emperor Maximilian. The other two countries were trying to collect debts from Mexico. Now, this was considered a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, of course, by the United States, but they were busy fighting a civil war. So Manet painted this after he had heard news of what happened, but before he had seen any pictures. And he assumed that the firing squad was Mexican. So you can see he has one rifleman facing us with a sombrero on, clearly Mexican, Mexican outfit. And the rest of the firing squad, you can see that they started out as sombreros. They've been sketched in, and they've kind of been changed to other hats. And in other words, he was trying to imagine the scene. This is a huge painting. It's in Boston, the Boston Fine Arts Museum. And it's a magnificent painting, if you see it. It's extremely modern. I mean, this could be a Picasso. The composition, the drama, the extreme sort of brevity of detail, the drawing all over it, the imagined landscape. He had no idea, of course, where this event occurred. If you get a chance to see this, I recommend you go. And like I said, it's in Boston. This is a masterpiece, but very modern. Notice the patterns of black and white. I'm going to be talking about that a lot. Okay, so this is the much more famous one. People always say this is inspired by Goya's 3rd of May, which it may very well have been, but Manet was not really a fan of Goya. He had been to the Prado, but he was really much more taken with Velázquez. And the truth is, the way this is painted is a lot more reminiscent of the Surrender of Breda masterpiece by Velázquez of soldiers and horses. But it has a terrible problem with perspective. Not one of these rifles is aiming at the emperor. They're all converging on a point that's off stage to the left. So here again, he's trying to use his imagination, but he probably posed one of these guys in his studio, or he may have even used a photograph for the firing squad. Although the rifleman all the way to the left is standing in 5th position, which I used to be a ballet dancer, and I can tell you that no rifleman ever stood in 5th position and shot a rifle. He would just fall over like a leaf. So I don't know where Manet got that idea. But again, notice the stark pattern of black and white. This big, wide bluish stripe across the middle of the canvas is very typical of Manet, who did these horizontal bands or cruciform compositions, which we'll talk about later. However, this group of people, the only sign of emotion really in the whole painting are the spectators looking over the wall. That is taken from Goya. I've seen the picture that was pretty much copied out of. And here's the same firing squad, only this time it's a completely different incident, something much closer to Manet's own experience. This is about the French army putting down the Commune in Paris. And this is 1871, I believe. And Manet, of course, was a communard. He was part of the Commune. And so was Courbet, who was nearly killed because of his connection to the Commune. And many other people. The Commune ruled Paris, just the city of Paris, not France, just the city, for about a year or two, and then were just massacred by the French army from the south under Napoleon III, I believe. And this was a tremendously bloody event. Many more people were killed than in the French Revolution. Was such a horrible, bloody experience that it's known as the Semaine Sanglante in France, the Bloody Week. And here is a painting by Manet, which is painted en plein air, which he didn't like to do. He did not consider him an impressionist. He thought of himself as a modern painter and a realist, but realist in the sense of the realist movement, in other words, as opposed to academic. And this happens to be a painting of Monet and his family. Monet was a very close friend of Manet. And this painting exhibits all the characteristics of Japanese painting that Whistler was so enthralled with. You can see that the same red is woven throughout the whole picture in little spots. The same violet color is on Manet's shirt and on his son's suit. Monet's wife is in black and white, so you have that black and white pattern again. And the entire picture is painted with the same brevity and simplicity and graphic elements. It's quite an unusual painting from Manet. If you could see this better, you would see that he barely describes Monet's wife. This is another very strange painting by Manet. You notice that's mostly black and white. And one of the things about modernism is pretty much all of the major figures of modernism, either at the beginning of their career or at some point in their career, painted mostly in black and white. And this was kind of a new approach to color, to start out by taking it away and then adding it a little bit at a time. So there are little spots of red and green and blue and this yellow in this painting, but most of it's black and white. Again, the same that big band of white across the top, cruciform composition. Crazy idea. Paint all of these top hats all lined up in a row. This big, huge black shape, which is a whole bunch of figures all just melded together. And the odd thing is that the subject of this painting is the masked ball. You notice that none of the men are wearing masks, only the women. Reminds me of some stuff that's going on right now. And this is a detail of Manet's portrait of Emile Zola, who is a big supporter of his. And I thought it was interesting to see what was on the wall in Manet's studio. Here is a print by Utagawa Kuniaki II. That's a woodblock print. Utagawa was not his name, that was the school he came from. Kuniaki II was actually a contemporary of Manet's. Ukiyo-e is, you know, style that goes back into the 18th century. So the Hiroshiges and Hokusais that people saw were not new, but this guy, this was a print of someone Manet's age in Japan. And then you see the engraving or copy of Velasquez Bacchus, and behind what looks like a photograph of Manet's own Olympia, which he's fooled around with so that Olympia has different hair, and she's now looking at Emile Zola, who was one of her major defenders in the public world in Paris. I have a few ukiyo-e prints here just to give you an idea of, you had to carve a whole block for each color. And all the lines had to be cut in reverse. In other words, you had to cut everything but the line. That's the way woodblock printing works. Mostly these blocks were cut by specialized craftsmen and just designed by the artist. But the constrictions of the medium meant that it was easier to have fewer colors. There's almost always a black and white element, a black and white block, the same way that we have a black element in our printing process right now, CMYK, the K stands for black. But notice perspective in all these pictures is a bird's eye view or a God's eye view. They are never drawn from someone who's a participant in the scene or who is in the same world. It's a different world, the floating world. That's what ukiyo-e means, the floating pictures from the floating world. Notice there's never any modeling or chiaroscuro in any of these, but very good drawing. So they made up for lack of drawing by describing form and space, just with really good drawing and design. And you could probably count the number of blocks here. There's a green, light blue, violet, and a yellow, and a pink. Anyway, European artists were very struck by how effective these pictures were. And these were the first pictures, original art that you could buy that were in color. Color photography was invented. Well, the first color photograph was taken by a Scottish physicist named James Clerk Maxwell. And let me see, I think about 1860 something. But the chemical ability to make color reproductions did not exist for quite a while. So there was a great novelty to be able to learn from the actual color originals, because artists in Europe before that mostly studied from engravings of paintings, black and white versions of engravings, as if the color was not an important part. This, of course, is Hokusai, one of the most famous images in all of art. Notice how stylized it is and how it could not be painted by an observer because you can't paint in the waves like this. This is part of the series 100 Views of Mount Fuji. But what strikes people about this is it's not that it looks real, it seems real. It gives you the impression of reality. It makes you feel an emotional connection to the scene, which often Western painting could not do. And many academic painters tried to do this kind of thing. But probably the realists were much better at it. Here again, you can see there's 4 colors in this whole picture, plus a black and white block. And yet it's so convincing. So part of modernism was the willing suspension of disbelief and simplicity. Now this is Henri Fantin-Latour, one of my favorite painters, who you could not call him an impressionist, but he was friends with all the impressionists. You couldn't call him an academic painter because he didn't pay any attention to their subjects. I consider him a modern painter because if you look at this book, say, you'll see it's just a perfectly flat, very carefully chosen color of blue. The flowers are, not heavily modeled. They're but very distinct in color. This big, wide, huge gray background is barely even modified, except by age. So Fantin-Latour was a protege of Manet's and also of Whistler's. Both Manet and Whistler gave him money, helped support him, tried to support his career. They both loved his paintings. He was one of the best draftsmen and colorists combined that I can think of. Some of my still lives, I try and paint like Fantin-Latour, and sometimes I try and paint like Manet, but that's basically it. At the end of his life, Manet did a bunch of these very quick, simple still lives. Usually they were gifts. And they're done with such ease and rapidity and simplicity, but they have all these marks of modernism to them. Flat colors, carefully chosen colors, the very, very carefully orchestrated compositions. Even if they're simple, they're extremely deft. This is Christian White trying to paint like Manet. As fast as you can. I did this pretty much without looking at what I was doing. And this is a detail of a Manet of a cat, which looks like it was painted in maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and may well have been. And I believe this was an addition. It's down in the corner of a big full-length formal painting of a figure. But Manet's characteristic gray ground runs right through this cat. So I think that the cat must have come in and he probably added it. So this is Berthe Morisot, who was very close friend of Manet's. It's hard not to believe that he was in love with her, even though she was married to his brother. Because all of his portraits of her are dazzling and beautiful. And I'm not suggesting they had a physical relationship, though they may have, but artists often feel that painting someone can be a substitute for a physical relationship because of the intimacy of the process. He was not only an admirer of her looks, but admired her painting very much. This particular painting is called Berthe Marceau with a bunch of violets, which you can see right below the V neck of her outfit. There's something, but you can't really tell what it is. It was this bunch of violets. Notice that they are not violet, but blue. And that's always puzzled me. There's also no violet in the previous painting. I suspect that Manet may have used mauve in these pictures. Mauvine was the first aniline dye. It caused a huge sensation. It was very popular, but it's turned out to be fugitive, which they probably didn't know at the time. And he may have very well mixed mauve with blue, and the mauve has since left us. Still, beautiful little still life. I put this picture in because it reminds me a little bit of this picture. It's very unusual for Manet to sidelight a portrait like this. And you notice the simplicity of the shapes. Well, this Vermeer is also sidelit in the same way. You'll notice the face, part of the face that's facing us is barely described. There's a couple of colors, almost no descriptive elements. The hat is undisguised brushstrokes, just a streak of red, and the blue is just a big blue shape basically, and then just the light is described. This is why we think of Manet as Vermeer as a modern painter, because of this. This painting's in the National Gallery in Washington, and if you go and see it, you will be knocked over because it's a very small painting, and it's definitely a surprise. When the first time I saw it, I completely rethought Vermeer, who was a big influence of mine at the time. And this is another painting of Berthe Marceau, which is in Rizzi's collection. So I was very, very familiar with this picture. Here again, you have just white and black and 2 or 3 colors. He had painted a previous painting of Baudelaire's Mistress in the same pose and the same big white dress like this, which is awful. It's the head is tiny, the perspective is ridiculous, and even this picture, he changed considerably. She was sitting upright, and he moved it. Anyway, he worked on this one until it was really good, and I can tell you that every time I went into the Rizzi Museum, this painting would knock me over. This is by Berthe Marceau. You could see how influenced she was by Manet, even though she insisted she was an impressionist. Here's another one of hers. Notice the extremely circumspect use of color. This is a sketch for the famous Art de Folie Bergère. Manet is sort of trying to make the perspective in the mirror work here. It still doesn't make any sense because you can see there's no table in the mirror between the woman and the customer. Manet did this a lot. He painted things that didn't make sense. This is the, of course, famous finished version. Again, a cruciform composition, a lot of black and white. But the perspective in the mirror is doesn't make any sense. If you see this group of bottles on the lower left or on the back of the table, and in the mirror they've been moved to the front of the table. The customer, who should be much smaller than the woman, because mirror doubles the distance, is actually bigger. So it's kind of like Manet is is imagining that we are that guy looking at this girl in this world. Um, it's largely fabricated, although they're recognizable elements of the actual Folie Bergère. And this is an actual waitress from the Folie Bergère who posed in Manet's studio behind this streaked white marble table that appears in so many of Manet's paintings. So I think the reason this is a modern painting is because it seems real. It's not based on a lot of information, a lot of facts. It's based on playing around with elements so that you have this feeling of being in an environment with this person. All right, I'm going to skip through some things. This is a beautiful late portrait done outside, which is rare for Manet again. If you could see this up close, most of her face is just Manet's gray ground. Manet used a very, very fine grained portrait linen, and usually with a gray gray ground on it. Anyway, I love this picture. This is Mary Laurent. This is very, very late in Manet's career when he was very weak and could hardly paint at all. And yet he did these beautiful pastels. I think these are pastel on canvas on that same super fine handkerchief linen. Notice that it's practically monochrome. There's just different types of red and white of different saturations and different values. This one's Irma Brunner. Same, very, very select group of colors, very powerful pattern. This is a sergeant, happens to also be of a cousin of mine from long ago. And it looks almost like an ang. It's so realistic looking. If you look at the way it's painted, it's so nonchalant and so rapid. And Sargent worked really hard to create this impression that this was so easy for him. It wasn't that easy for him. It took him often many tries, and he would often wipe out one of these paintings over and over again with a knife until it looked like it had been this easy. So it's a modernist concept, the idea that you didn't really try very hard. There's another sergeant of my great aunt, Elizabeth Chandler Chapman. Sergeant was a very close friend of my family's. My grandfather stayed in his apartment in Rome during World War I when he was stationed in Rome. But here again is a basically black and white pattern with yellow. It's a very, very select group of colors, yellow and orange. This, believe it or not, is Manet, but if you look at just this piece of it, it could be by Dievenkorn. And I might well have thought this was a sergeant. Sergeant, very heavily influenced by me. This is a Christian White trying to look like a sergeant or a Manet. Whistler, this is Symphony in White by Whistler of his mistress. Very hard to paint a white figure on a white background. But you do see that in those ukiyo-e prints. And Whistler was absolutely obsessed with Eastern art and Japanese sense of decorative use of color. And this one's William Merritt Chase. So the only thing harder than painting a white figure on a white background is a black figure on a black background, which is really hard. I've tried this, believe me, it's so difficult. But the lack of information is one of the things that makes this work. If you look up close, you can see that all of these textures are only suggested with paint. And the whole bottom half of the picture is just this couple of vague brushstrokes of pink and white and black. If it weren't for this shoe, we wouldn't even know she was standing up. Another William Merritt Chase with many of the same properties. Here again, you see him not really describe anything in the picture, but make a pattern of red and yellow and white shapes and black shapes. Here again, very few other people would have the colors so dominate a picture like this. But again, the same blue is woven throughout the picture, in the background, in the flowers, in the vase, in the dress. These are all Oriental ideas. I'm gonna not talk about this. A couple more chases. This is a Manet painted from life, except that he was inside his studio. This is just a view out of his studio, not the one on the Rue St. Petersburg. And here's another picture of the same view while they're recobbling the street. You could see that when he was painting from life, this is an action painting. This is a sort of de Kooning-like brushwork. Absolutely no interest in detail or in illusion or subterfuge. It's only the whole painting that he's interested in. This is actually a Eugene Boudin from about the same time. Boudin was a realist, then impressionist, and then he became this, person who painted like Manet, like many late 19th century people. This is by Joaquin Sorolla. It's not one of my favorite paintings. I just put it in here because Sorolla was another one of the same group, like Sargent and Whistler and Manet. And he very, very deft use of sunlight and water. And look them up. I couldn't find my book of Sorolla's, so this was the best I could find, but great painter. Here's a Matisse, which I almost might have mistaken for a Fairfield Porter. That's how much people, Matisse learned from Manet, and then other people learned from Matisse about using color, flat areas and patterns and lines, and having the whole thing look like real space. Here it's even more extreme. Notice there's no modeling. The same color reappears several times. Here again, the same pattern and same color in the same value on the wall and on the tablecloth. And the same yellow circles are on the table, in the flower vase, and in the landscape outside. So Manet spent a lot of time figuring out how to paint an interior and exterior at the same time. He would just make the lighting the same, make the values the same. I'm sorry, this is a tiny picture of a huge picture, the Moroccans of Matisse. Here again, we have this black background with white lines, black and white, rectilinear shapes. Only 5 colors, I think, in the whole picture, maybe 4, besides black and white. And yet, this painting is so moving when you're there. This one even more so. There's a huge painting that's in Chicago at the Art Institute. Black and white and two colors. That's it. Huge over life-size figures that all exist in front of the picture plane. Um, One of the most modern paintings I can think of, yet painted at the beginning of the 20th century. This is Casimir Malevich of black, white, and red. Someday I'll do a whole lecture about the colors black, white, and red, and Edwin Land. But here's another one of a black square inside a white square. Now, my Dutch grandfather told me never to use black pigments because they'd all been burned and were structurally unstable. And you can see that that is the case here. This was obviously painted over another painting, and this craquelure is the black pigment not being able to grip whatever white, probably oily white object was underneath it. So the objection to black paint was really a structural objection to the actual molecular structure. This is an Ad Reinhardt from the 60s, much, much later, decades later. And I never liked Ad Reinhardt because he said that he was the last painter on earth, that he had so whittled down painting to its basic elements that no one could ever make a painting after him. And yet, this is a problem with minimalism. If your ideas are simple enough, it's a pretty good chance somebody else has done the exact same idea before you. Here's Joseph Albers' Concentric Squares, a much more famous series, Homage to the Square. Now, Albers was a great colorist, not one of my favorite painters, but his book about color, The Interaction of Color, should be required reading for anybody who's interested in color and modernism. This is Frank Stella, who I hated. But the only painting I ever saw of his that had space in it was the black and white versions of this series, which I don't think the ones I saw in person were huge. I don't think they had these white lines in between them. But as a colorist, he never made any sense to me. Fairfield Porter was a really close friend of my mother's. Knew him all my life. I never really thought I was that influenced by Fairfield, actually. He just seemed like the logical way to paint. But I was in his studio when he was doing this series in the 70s of these waves. And that was when I realized that he was not just an observational painter. He was painting his ideas, not just painting the thing he was looking at. And because a lot of these laughing waves are very stylized. I could see how he was working on them in the studio, not standing on the beach. And they have all these same signatures of modernism that the other people.
Okay, Christian,
Yes?
we have a question.
Sure. Shoot.
What was the book about color?
The Interaction of Color by Joseph Albers is universally obtainable, most famous book about color ever written. The Interaction of Color. Does that answer the question? So this is a self-portrait by Casimir Malevich, who I am kind of a fan of as a precursor of many of the tenets of modernism. You could see he was both a great draftsman and great colorist, which most of my heroes were. But this is a Malevich that reminds me a little bit of the colors of Diebenkorn or Fairfield. But notice it has this black and white element and then the colors. This is very early Malevich, another early Malevich. This is much more typical of what we think of constructivism, which was his movement, sometimes confused with I'm sorry, his movement was suprematism, which is sometimes confused with constructivism. They were two movements that believed the opposite things, and yet paintings looked almost the same, which is typical of idealists. Uh, and this is Gorky, the logical successor to Malevich and Matisse and Manet and all of these people. I'm a huge Gorky fan. Uh, you can see the same principles, black and white designs, shapes, recurring colors. But Gorky had the whole world in his mind that only he could see. This is a sketch for a mural in an airport. And this is kind of typical of Gorky, of making a real space, having all this pentimento here, erasures, and all these clearly defined objects, which none of us know what they are. His own world, his own mind. Gorky, of course, his biggest protege was de Kooning. They were extremely close. But he and de Kooning also were good friends with Philip Gustin, who I'll talk about in a minute. It's my favorite de Kooning. This was done very late in his life, in 82, I think, 1982, when most people didn't take his painting seriously at all. But this painting is a tribute to Arshile Gorky. It's called Pirate. It has many of the properties of Gorky. It's unlike the late paintings, which seem so simple. If you see this, it has very rich textures and layering and scratching and these shapes and these drawn lines, and impossible to experience from the reproduction. You have to go and see it. It's in the Modern Art Museum's collection. Not always on view, but when it is, you should definitely see this. I was not a big fan of de Kooning's all my life. I am now. But this is my favorite one from when he was very old. This is, I'm sorry, a very small file of a famous Fairfield Porter, often referred to as Four Ugly People. It's his wife, his male lover, his daughter, all looking awkward. But here again, you have the same cruciform construction like Manet. The inside space, outside space, lighting treated identically, owes a great deal to Manet. And this happens to be a Fairfield Portrait of my mother, painted in our house. So painted quite rapidly, not in his studio, in someone else's house. They were very close friends. Fairfield got my mother her job as an art critic at Art News, and that was a whole new career for her at the time. But this is a mutual friend. This is a close friend of my dad's and of Fairfield Porter's, Paul George's. Another very modern painter who happened to be a figurative painter. He was a very strange man, a huge puzzle. I was puzzled by his work my whole life. He was a famous teacher. I thought that the things that he said were crazy. But with every passing year, I consider him a more giant figure in late 19th century painting. Here's another one. Paul George's went out of his way to make sure he could paint things that he didn't look at, that he wasn't seeing, that he could just manufacture figures and action and space. He did many life-size portraits of himself, self-portraits, seen from the back. So just to make a point out of that. And Wolf Kahn was also a friend and a huge influence on me. Wolf Kahn was really a great colorist. But he told my dad that he thought that if he stopped painting barns, that it would be the end of his career, because he had painted himself into a corner by his subject. And modernism and this kind of color composition is not about the subject. Here's another barn. Here's the same barn again. Barns again. But the color is new. This is modern color space. This is one of my favorites. Extremely simple. Even when you had almost no color, just this sort of violet gray, still gorgeous. And this is a Matisse from very late in Matisse's life, which I think probably influenced Wolf a great deal, and also Diebenkorn. Wolf Kahn, early Christian white, kind of trying to paint like Wolf Kahn. Pretty obvious who I was looking at. Now this is a very recent Christian white. This is a very large painting. This is one of my favorite paintings I've ever done, although again, you can't experience it on a screen. The scale is integral to this picture, but this has got color ideas in it that I have worked on all my life and am only now starting to understand. This is another recent from last year. These are even more recent, just some sketches of mine, obviously Diebenkornish. This is me trying to paint like Manet again. Me trying to paint like Diebenkorn. And this is Fairfield Porter, believe it or not, from 1951, early Porter. And this is Fairfield Porter in 1965, trying to paint like Diebenkorn. You could see how closely related all of these people are, even through time. This is very late Manet. Looks like a Diebenkorn. Early Diebenkorn. Here's Diebenkorn's black and white period. Like I say, de Kooning's masterpiece, Excavation, basically black and white. Franz Klein, most of his paintings black and white. Almost every modern colorist that I can think of went through a period where they stripped out the color. These are very late Diebenkorns. These are from the 80s of the Ocean Park series. And you can see that he was fascinated with perspective. Even when he was using just geometrical shapes, it still looks like telescopic perspective. Which is why this is, by the way, Diebenkorn playing with the mirror. But his perception, I've done so many road paintings and pavements and telephone lines that I feel like Diebenkorn and I obsessed with a lot of the same things. You notice the top of this painting has telescopic perspective in it, which tends to turn things into abstract shapes. Diebenkorn, of course, was both figurative and abstract, like me. I love that. Here is Diebenkorn making a square within a square. Just a few colors. Subject is just a tool for composition, and the sort of perspective in these power lines is something that I'm always doing. This is a Christian white trying to look like a Diebenkorn. And this is Philip Gustin, who is one of my favorite painters now. There's a huge show of Philip Gustin being organized that's been put on hold because of COVID. But it'll be coming soon to a museum near you, and go and see it. The guy is absolutely baffling. All his paintings seem to be self-portraits as a Ku Klux Klanman with a finger pointing at him, or he had tremendous guilt, not reasonably, but tremendous guilt about race. And maybe these paintings are indictment, maybe they're not, I don't know. He also loved feet and legs, even if not so much the bodies. And these are enormous paintings. So all I can say is go and see them. Gustin was a very popular abstract expressionist of the New York School in the 50s. And his favorite colors are black, white, and red. Again, someday I'll do a lecture on black, white, and red. People often ask me how I keep my colors so clean. And really, it's just that I'm able to make colors and they aren't because they don't have any discipline on their palette. This is my grandfather's palette, a really beautiful palette. But you can see its whole history has had the color arranged in the same way, with light colors on the top, dark colors on the bottom, warm colors on the right, cool colors on the left. Gray colors I mix in the middle, brighter colors on the outside. If you just do that, if you can just remember do that, notice green is actually between red and blue in the spectrum. So that's where I put my greens. But if you can just keep your palette organized, you should be able to make whatever colors you want. However, most of my students, at the end of 3 hours of painting, I look at their palette and it's all gray. It's all the same color because they just randomly try and mix all these different colors. Doesn't work. This is the modern color triangle as opposed to Isaac Newton's color triangle. What we know about painting now, magenta, yellow, and cyan are the actual primaries in painting. And you can see that green is not the opposite of red. On the contrary, they're right next to each other on the visible spectrum. Not going to get into the science too much. This was figured out by James Clerk Maxwell, who I mentioned before. He did the very first color photograph in the 19th century. And this is two kinds of black. The bottom is black pigment. The top one is ultramarine blue and burnt umber mixed together. Before the 19th century, I would say, that's the black. That mixed black is what is in most of the paintings that you see because of the poor qualities of carbon. We know this, for instance, because they've taken X-ray chromatographs of Rembrandt's paintings. Rembrandt didn't use black as a pigment, but he did draw with charcoal when he first started the painting. And so you can see the X-rays show just the drawing, just the charcoal drawing underneath the paint. All right, we're just over an hour here. I have these are a few of my paintings trying to display some of the ideas I've been talking about here. And with that, I'm going to ask if people have questions. So I'm going to stop, see if I can do this. Exit. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And does anybody have any questions? Or has anybody been listening? Gabby, you still there?
Yeah, we have only one question, which you answered before.
Just that one?
Yeah, people have been pretty quiet for questions.
Nobody has any questions about color? People are always asking me about color. And, you know, I know a great deal about it if anybody's curious. What can I say without showing you a painting? Maybe it's easier if you're not distracted by a picture. The main thing I would say about color is use it with care. Hans Hofmann, one of the most famous modernist painters, famous for being a colorist, didn't allow his students to use it at all. I know that personally from Paul Georges, who said they got black and white and that's it. So if you limit yourself to just a few colors, or I've done a lot of paintings that are just black and white and red, or just black and white and yellow. You'd be surprised how creative you get, how inventive you can be when you have that limitation. And Most of the time, new ideas come from some kind of limitation.
So we have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So from Victor Vaccaro, what do you think about Frank Morley Fletcher's color control?
Unfamiliar with it, but I can tell you I've seen many books about color, and most of them are practically useless. Some of them have the science right, some of them don't. Even Joseph Albers had the wrong 3 primaries in this color triangle. Most of the books that I've seen by artists about color are full of their paintings with terrible color in them. It's important to know that color is an emotional and personal tool. So there aren't a lot of rules which are very helpful because experiment and your personal experience is probably going to be much better for you. Certainly looking at other great paintings and seeing in which ones the colors work and move you and have effect is probably the best lessons you can learn about color. As far as color in representational painting, I don't recommend trying to learn that from books. I'm sorry, I don't know if that's a book or what, but I'm unfamiliar with it. Maybe could you ask him what the ideas are?
Another question from Joan Rockwell. How do you keep your colors so pure on the canvas, especially in still lifes?
Joan, I just answered that. Were you not watching? The palette. I don't ever recommend people use disposable palettes. Hard palettes are better. Color is a matter of discipline. So if people are too lazy to clean their palettes, they're giving up a lot of control. A lot of people simply try to paint with paint that's half dried on their palette. Don't do that anymore. De Kooning every morning would wake up to a studio which had bowls of colors that had been mixed by his assistants. Very specific colors that he'd given them formulas for, with water and safflower oil mixed into them, and that's a lot of work to be able to be free with color. But if you're just going to be random about mixing colors and where you put them and what they are, what pigments you use, and just hope for the best, I have to tell you that hoping for the best is the worst strategy that I know of in painting. Experimenting, self-confidence, having an idea and pursuing it, those are all good strategies. But hoping for the best, not so good. Anything else?
Yes, yeah, we actually have a whole bunch of questions here. We have from Roseanne Albanese, we have, when doing plein air, green dominates. How do I vary the distances in the scene? What should I introduce color-wise to keep it interesting?
Okay, nobody's going to like this answer, but I have painted the landscape for 30 years at least. I'm known as a landscape painter, and I mostly don't use green pigments at all. Green is not a primary color. It's a primary color in additive systems, but not in paint. You can mix greens perfectly well with other colors, especially with modern colors, because of the invention of cadmiums, cadmium yellow. Cadmium yellow and black will make green. Cadmium yellow and ultramarine will make green. You can get a brighter green mixing it with cerulean. I never use phthalos, so I don't use phthalo green at all. And I would recommend everybody painting the landscape, try getting rid of all the greens, and many of the greens with all different names, Windsor green, all actually contain phthalo. Um, Phthalo has such a powerful tinting strength that it will remove your ability to make anything else. So if you can't vary your greens, how are you going to differentiate greens in the distance? So try just that. Get rid of all the green pigments. Uh, Green pigments have been a rarity in the history of art. By Manet's time, there was cobalt green, which I believe was one of the ones he liked. There was something called emerald green, which was copper arsenite, which people really loved it. Extremely poisonous. Most people think that emerald green is what killed Napoleon because they used it on wallpaper in the place where he was living for a long time. So a lot of effort has gone into chasing greens, but be careful. Be careful with green pigments. Try eliminating phthalo blue from your palette. It will just make everything phthalo blue. It's way, way more powerful. These are aniline colors. These are artificial dyes. They're not real pigments. They all have the property of dyeing the oil film, the medium, in a way that overcomes other colors. So I use ultramarine blue, cerulean, cobalt, never phthalo. I'll use chrome sesquioxide. It's usually called as chrome oxide greens, great pigment, not poisonous, not fugitive. I might sometimes use a cadmium green, but not often. Mostly I'll mix blue and yellow together and put it in a tube, and that's my green. Is that helpful at all?
It actually kind of segues into the next question. What are the advantages or problems with modern pigment formulations versus traditional mixes?
Well, that's a very good question. A great deal of what happened with Impressionism and color in the 19th century was due to new colors that were invented. One of the most famous ones was mauve. Mauvine was the first aniline dye. It was just exploded as a passion and then turned out to be something you should never use in painting. But we have other pigments that will match the color now. Cobalt Violet was a new addition. Cobalt Violet's a pretty good pigment. Of course, quinacridone is even more new. That's the first true magenta pigment that we've had. It's a primary color in painting, but I wouldn't recommend using it too much because it is also a dye. So in theory, yellow, quinacridone, magenta, and phthalo blue would be the primary colors in painting, but in practice, they're not. The magenta and the phthalo are just not very good pigments, and so they're clumsy. So not so much difference between traditional and modern as far as the actual paint goes. The truth is that that the more different colors you have available to you, the harder it is to control them. So I would just try limiting the colors, the number of colors. I would try to stay away from a lot of the pigments which are really dyes. So those are called lakes technically in painting. A lake is a dye which has been used to dye a colorless material, which makes up the body of the paint. So we try not to use those so much anymore. What else could I say? Yeah, if you give a child all of the colors that we have, they will have trouble making a picture. If you give them 7, they'll probably make a beautiful picture. I mean, the instincts towards color are usually good. It's usually having too many opportunities that makes bad color. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Okay, so another question from Baruch May. Would you elaborate on your use of color in your paintings? I experience your colors as vibrant and alive.
Yeah, you know, I've often been accused of exaggerating the colors that I see, but that's really, really not true at all. It's to me, color is so brilliant in life that it's you can't exaggerate it. I mean, what painting do you know that exceeds real life? The things that exceed real life are the ideas of the artist, the designs, the concepts, it's the communication. I consider art communication plus play. So very, very important part of any art is playfulness and especially surprise. So when people say, oh, you have vibrant colors, it may be that they're surprised by the colors. It may be just that they don't expect them to be what I see them. But the truth is we all see color differently. The, uh, the pigments in our receptor cells in your retina, in the cones, are extremely polymorphic. That means that the molecules, the DNA that produces those molecules is very susceptible to change from generation to generation. And so they're not the same in everybody. And there are many people who are tetrachromats, many people who are dichromats because they're colorblind. I don't really quite know how to answer that, except my advice about the palette. You can extend that to in your studio. You know, spend time mixing your colors until they're exactly the color you want, and pay close attention to the relationship between the colors. I have a rather elaborate technique of mixing and pre-preparing colors that I know exactly how I can control them. So there, and the green pigment is one of the things, like for instance, if you're painting a sky and you have green pigment on your palette, it's going to be very, very hard. There's no greens in the sky. And you put a little bit of green pigment up there, it starts to pollute everything. You know, so that's pretty much all I can think of saying. But if you look at Diebenkorn, you could see a lot of my color ideas come from Diebenkorn, Matisse, all the people I've shown you, Mary Cassatt, great painter. I look at all paintings from all periods. I look a lot of contemporary painting. I've studied the theory of perception. If you wanted to read another book about color and perception, you might try The Doors of Perception and its sequel, which is called Heaven and Hell. Written by my uncle, Aldous Huxley, but he was one of the most intelligent people writing about perception, and those are very, very important to my education.
Another question from Denise Zaleski. What's recommended to study color theory?
Well, color theory can mean a lot of different things. I mean, the science of color is very complicated. Color perception especially is extremely complicated. It's very interesting. How much it will help you as a painter, I'm not really sure. The Joseph Albers book, I can definitely recommend because he was preoccupied with figuring out what color does, how it aids and how it confuses our perception. The book is full of illusions that are called by color. So reading that book will tell you what color will do and what it won't do and how you can use it. But I'm sorry to say that I don't really think that rules about color help. There have been a lot of books written with enormous sense of authority about how you produce color harmony. They are all based on wrong information and misunderstanding, people who don't really know the science. A little, in color, a little bit of knowledge is a very dangerous thing. There are no rules. There are ideas. All I can say is try and express your ideas with the color. Don't take the colors for granted. Don't ever assume that something is a certain color. When I'm painting, I'm always just painting the light that's coming to me from the subject. I'm not trying to describe the subject, just the light. And that's about the best advice I could give. I haven't read many of those books, but I've looked through many books about color theory, and I have to say that most of the time, I think they're complete baloney. By the way, I know many interior decorators who have studied color composition and harmony and stuff like that. And they make the absolute worst color decisions in interiors that you can imagine because they don't just trust their instincts. What else could I say about that? This is a very important question. It's important to know that most of the people in the world, in art schools, in art classes, in primary school, still believe that the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. Well, that's not true in any world. I mean, it's just not true. It's only things that people have taught each other and then not paid attention to new knowledge. The red, yellow, and blue idea is from the 17th century. It was Isaac Newton. But Isaac Newton didn't know the difference between additive and subtractive color even, which any computer programmer understands perfectly well. And anybody with a printer should understand, because every printer that any of you have has CMYK inks, cyan, magenta, and yellow. They have a black because of the inadequacy of the actual pigments in those other three colors. But those are the primary colors in pigments. Additive primaries are for light sources, like your television screen or your phone. And the additive primaries are red, green, and blue, which are the three colors that we all basically see and that we basically make all of our colors out of in our brain. But nowhere is red, yellow, and blue primary colors. It's just not a set of primary colors. And yet, you could buy a book that thinks they are, and you could buy a book that knows they aren't. How are you going to tell the difference? Anything else?
Okay, we have two more, I think, that are.
It's great. I love it that this many people are.
Decide if the shadow is warm or cool. That's from Annette Napolitano.
How do you decide whether shadow is warm or cool?
Shadow is warm or cool.
Whether it's a shadow or the light side, whatever it is, just look at where is the light coming from. What's the source of the light? So in the landscape, if you have a blue sky, the sky is a huge area. So you have this big source of blue light. But if it's cloudy, then the shadows are not going to be bluer than the light side. If there's an object nearby that's the sun is shining on, then that light will bounce into the shadows. So if you have grass, say, and you can look at almost any white building in the sunlight, if the sun's high, look under the eaves of the building and you see that the light is yellow, that the shadows are blue on the bottom because those are lit by the sky. But the ones on the top are sheltered from the sky, and the light is bouncing off the grass, which you and I think of as green, but grass has both green and red pigments in it. And you mix green and red together, you get yellow. And so the impression you will usually get is that that light is yellow. So in any case, whatever you're painting, whatever the environment, if you're indoors or outdoors, look at what is the source of the light that is lighting that part of an object, or that shadow. If you have a wall that's green, that's probably influencing the color in the shadow. If you have two different colored light sources, this is a favorite thing in both filmmaking and comic books, then you will have one color on one side and the other color on the other side of an object. Is that helpful?
Okay, then we have, what is the story with black, white, and red? When did that emerge as a prominent palette? That's from Sky White.
Oh, that's my son, Sky. Good question. From many places at once, partly just from basic human experience. Red, iron oxide, what we call Indian painting stones, which is iron ore, and especially meteoric iron. So that's iron meteors that have been burnt as they've gone through the atmosphere, have always been an easy source of the color red. This is why barns were always painted red, because it was very easy to make the color. All you need some iron, you turn it into rust, and you have free red paint. It's very cheap, and it's a very good pigment. That's Mars red. So a lot of early painting was charcoal and chalk and iron oxide. But when the Bauhaus came along, the Bauhaus artists and architects and designers, graphic designers, couldn't help but notice that black and white and red were extremely useful in communication. So you will see a lot of posters, for instance, with those colors, black, white, and red. You'll see a lot of art that's black, white, and red starting about then. So there's just there's a natural affinity, but there was an important event in the 20th century when Edwin Land, who invented the Polaroid land camera and invented polarized lenses and things like that, did a lot of experiments with color. And he was reproducing an experiment by James Clerk Maxwell, who I told you before, a great Scottish physicist from the 19th century. And he noticed that if he added just the red component to a black and white image, in other words, just the instance of red, that your brain would fill out the other colors, that you would experience it as a color picture, even though there was only one color, because whenever you introduce a color, your brain and your eyes, and this is a mechanism in your retinas, will start to introduce its opposite into neutral colors. So I have a whole slideshow that I could show that reproduces that experiment. But Edwin Land then developed this theory that red by itself is enough to give us a sense of the world being in color. That you could have only, in other words, that you could have only two different colors. So it's a little bit like what being a dog might feel like. A dog sees two different colors. But the fact that that works has made people want to try it a lot. I mean, a lot of abstract painting is red, white, and like I say, go look all the way through Philip Gustin's work back to the 50s, and you will see black, white, and red over and over and over again. Red, of course, the most emotional color because it means both sex and passion and war. You know, if anybody's been watching Mars for the last few days, it's been extremely bright and very red. Supposedly there's a dust storm going on Mars. No accident that they named the planet after the god of war. So you know, it's a subject I could speak on a lot, but I would say that those are the two of the main reasons.
One last question. You have had a lot of people just commenting they enjoyed your presentation, but one more question. This is from Fran Wolanzik. She says, so you're saying that to go with your instinct rather than what you think you see? I think that refers back to the discussion about...
No, that's not really what I meant. Manet, when he was very old, towards the end of his life, when he did many of his very best paintings, witnesses who watched him paint a portrait, say, describe him not even looking at the subject. That he was painting his idea of the subject. He didn't need really very much information from the sitter. He was painting the ideas in his head. And the truth is that everybody is always painting the ideas in their head. Nobody is ever looking at the subject and painting at the same time. I mean, you can try and do that, but that's automatic painting. It's not really what you think. But you're always painting from memory, and your memory doesn't encode the pictures, it encodes the ideas in the pictures.
Just to interrupt, Fran has actually sent another message saying, I meant about the choice of color.
Right. So the choice of color, I was talking about color composition, that your instincts are probably better than rules because color is very personal. If everybody followed the same rules, color would stop being interesting, be boring. But most people don't ever paint what they see. I mean, from observing students in class, I see that they're always looking at their painting much more than they're looking at the subject. And they're painting what they expect to see instead of what they actually are looking at. So I would say if you're painting from a still life or landscape or from a subject, you're an observational painter, trying to get rid of all of your expectations of the colors of what you're looking at. Don't think of the objects or the space or the subject as having color. It doesn't. The color is something that's invented in your brain. What you're looking at is light. And if you think of it only as light and ignore the subject entirely, forget what the subject is, forget everything that you expect the subject to be, it would probably be better color that way. So anyway, as a teacher, that's my experience, is that most people, by the time they're 16, have developed a great deal of perceptual constancies. That means that their brain is trying to figure out what color everything is. And so it starts making assumptions about them. And pretty soon it starts not being able to see local color at all. It only sees what the computer has decided the thing is. And that's what people who are older than 12 will tend to paint. is just what they expect the colors to be. What, in other words, what their brain has figured out the thing itself to be. And artists who've had a real education starting at least by 12 don't have those color perceptual constancies. In other words, they see what they're looking at. They don't just interpret what the thing is. And this is true of perspective, it's true of color, and it's true of value. It's true of all of those things. You need to completely lose your perceptual constancies, and with every year that you age, that gets to be harder and harder. It's very, very hard to change later in life. So I would recommend that serious art education start by 8, but certainly by 12 when the mind is extremely plastic, and your perception will be changed forever. Forget who asked that question, but
Fran Wolanzik.
well,
I'd like to thank you very much for
yeah, I really enjoyed the questions. That was
yeah, you had a lot of very good questions.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I just would like to remind everyone to check the website, theatelier@flowerfield.org, both for the start of our next series of classes, which will start on February 4th. It's another 4-week session. Registration for that should be open within the next week. And also keep your eye on the website for the next lecture, which will be coming sometime in February. We will post it as soon as we have full details. So Christian, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And I would wish everyone a very good night.
It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it. And thank everybody who listened to me for an hour and 45 minutes now.